All right, Joy, are we ready to go?
We are ready to go.
Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for attending today and for your questions. Those of you who responded to Joy's questionnaire that she sent out in advance, that was useful to see. This is going to be a brief introduction. I just want to say, and I'll say it again at the end, that and both Joy and I are here to help and to support you in your endeavors. We first worked together back in 2019 in January because the IMLS came out with an Accelerating Promising Practices grant offering that's not available at this point, but they did it for a couple different years. And we decided we would do a series of workshops around the state together to try to encourage public libraries to apply specifically for the community memory option under that grant. And I'm really proud that Marshfield Library got one of the grants the first year, and then the Moore Free Library down in Newfane did the year after. So I say that up front just to say that there is opportunity to go for some of the larger federal grants, but that isn't the only thing out there. And I hope that by the end you will have a sense of the wide range of potential funders available to you without feeling completely overwhelmed about what is available out there. So just to give you a sense, I'm going to talk a bit about the big picture before diving into more kind of nuts and bolts about strategies for thinking about a specific proposal for a project that you have in mind. So on the big picture front, and this is, you can be inspired by a grant opportunity you read about that then makes you go see how ready you are to apply for that opportunity. Or you might just have a general sense that you want to be ready should that come out. But there's quite a bit you can do and should do without trying to make this sound too overwhelming to be ready for those opportunities when they do come to pass, or when there's a project, an idea that someone comes to you with and you say, you know, I think that'd be fantastic program. We don't have the funds, but there's an organization out there that might be willing to support this. But in order to be in a good position to pivot when you have that, either the opportunity presented by a funder or the idea, whether it's coming from you, your staff, the board, your community, it's good to have some of this stuff prepared. Having a mission, knowing why you exist and what it is that you do, the audience you serve, have a current strategic plan or identified priorities in place. And this is all stuff that Tanya and others at VT Lib can help you with, that your board should be involved with. And it was great to see Cindy post on the list this morning about how many people in Vermont libraries are looking to restart strategic planning processes that might have been stalled due to the pandemic, or who have realized that priorities have maybe shifted somewhat seismically because of the pandemic. So it's a good time to jump into strategic planning, to revise or refresh, review, and to do that collaboratively and within your community, and to bring in stakeholders to help you with that. Also, you know, again, bit of a punch list here. Make sure that you've got a good collection development policy and other procedural documents that Tanya will help you determine are appropriate for you to be having, and that might help show that you're ready, and that funders can look at you as a good risk for support, for financial support. Now, that it's good to also data collect, and what data you gather will depend in part on what your priorities are, what your strategic plan is saying you want to maybe focus on expanding or shoring up or building. So it may be that you want to make sure you have your circulation stats for the last few years. If you have meeting rooms, are you tracking how frequently they are used by number of groups and number of bodies? Some of this, of course, challenging during the pandemic, but as places open up, you can start to think about traffic and how people are attending programs, either virtually or in person. And I bring up the building maintenance log because a lot of folks who responded to Joy's questionnaire indicated they were interested in funds specifically for building repair renovation. So having some sort of log that shows over time what has been done or not done to your building, what events have happened to it, when there's been repairs, that can help you kind of make the case for the need. Pictures are also good for that. But again, if these are not the types of records you're currently maintaining, think about how you might start doing that and how you might be able to backfill, if possible, from scattered data you might have around. Also good to kind of take the temperature of your board of trustees. And if you're a municipal library, certainly of your municipality. Is there a sense that they would support a project, or is it not the time? And there sometimes can be competition for the same funding streams or funding sources. And I know that's happened sometimes even within larger libraries. It can happen within departments within a library where there's one idea for how to use a project to approach a funder about, but you get edged out with your collection development idea because someone's already going to them from your library for new furniture. So, and that can happen too. So again, good communication, as always, is an important place to start, but making sure that there's interest and folks are going to help you through this process who are ready to be involved as well. And again, depending on what your priorities are or what you're thinking you might be interested in pursuing, reach out and talk to relevant external experts in that field. You know, if it is renovation, you know, and if you're best practice would be to have some of these skill sets on your board of trustees, of course. So you have someone who's maybe a contractor who can kind of walk around the building with you and identify what really are the areas of concern, what they think the top priorities are, and bring folks in who, if you don't have that expertise already within your library community, bring in other folks to see what they would say or what do you think. And outside perspectives can often be really helpful. It's also great to get ideas of what other people have done, and sharing information about the programming that really took off in your community, or the Vermont Humanities Council speaker that just had everybody buzzing. It's great to kind of share all of that with each other, and librarians are wonderful about sharing information. So it's not a hard sell with you guys to say, talk to each other, tell each other what worked, what didn't, and think about, if you're thinking about building things collaboratively too, are there things you could go for together that might make it, might be bigger projects? But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. The other thing to think about is kind of the situational awareness, I'll say, which is having a sense of the landscape. What are the trends out there relating to funding? What are the different types of funders? What resources can you go to find funders? And how do you, once you've found someone, how do you find out whether that's a good fit for the project that you might have in mind, or learn more about them so you can figure out if you have a project that they might be interested in supporting? So some of the trends that have held for the last few years are increasingly applications are all done online. So things that you need a certain facility with online forms sometimes, and of course, in a reasonable connection to the internet, things that we can't always take for granted here in Vermont, and I certainly don't. So knowing that you're going to have to be doing this process online is important. Increased volume of proposals received by funders. Although interestingly, I was talking to Vermont Arts Council staff last week, and they said that the number of people who submitted for their cultural facilities grants were down, which is the first time I've ever heard that. So that can go up and down and can vary over time. But you can. I say this because it's another push to try to make your project stand out and be unique. Know that there's just going to be a lot of traffic out there. In order to do that, it's really important to have a compelling narrative in your proposal, to be able to succinctly describe what it is you want to do and make that case for why it's a no-brainer that that ought to be supported and that it's a really good fit with that particular funder's areas of particular interest. More often than not, you now have to have measurable deliverables. You have to say you're going to do X of Y in this amount of time, and quantifying or otherwise identifying how you're going to meet set performance objectives is something you're going to have to think about, and it's good to think about that in advance. How are you going to prove, to show that you you've made an impact with this project. I've bolded interest in reaching underserved communities because I think this has become increasingly compelling to funders, and funders do strategic planning too, and it's something that they are really laser focused on. They want to reach communities that they've had no success reaching before, and they look to the folks they're funding, the organizations they're funding, as the boots on the ground who are closer and more connected to those communities and can help them reach them. And underserved can be defined in many different ways. And here in Vermont, the argument could be made, kind of like when Joy and I were doing the Accelerating Promising Practices grants, which were for small rural libraries, that maybe with the exception of Burlington, all the libraries in Vermont probably fit the national definition of small and rural. So underserved can be rural, can be below the poverty line, can be without internet, has never been in a library before. So the funders are waiting and searching for ways to reach folks that they haven't been able to reach before. There's also interest in the alignment of your proposed project with your own strategic plan. So of course, this presupposes you have a strategic plan, which is why that's part of the prep work. There is interest in building your institutional capacity, and kind of tied in with that, long-term impact and sustainability issues. So I think one of the reasons that the More Free Library was successful with their IMLS grant was that the board of trustees committed to, after the end of the 2-year project, for which they got $50,000, to do an oral history project and make that available online within their community, that the library would commit to 4 hours a week of the librarian's time, kind of in perpetuity, to continue that as an ongoing project of the library, and that they would continue to pay for the website. So that also shows, again, back to that commitment, that internal commitment, that your institution is backing you up. Organizations who are funding will see that as a positive, that they want their projects to not just be these blips that happen for a year and that was great and that was over. And I say this, but of course there are certain types of programming grants where it may be you bring in some fabulous speakers for a year, and there will be less of a long tail from those kind of programming projects potentially. And there's high interest in collaborative projects and creative ones too. I mean, you can work together as a bunch of librarians, you can work together with other community groups, and think about the, again, needs of your community as a whole, and who's in a position to help meet that from an organizational perspective, and are there interesting ways you could work together. So there's government funders, and there's all sorts of other funders, and just to kind of parse out some of the distinctions between the two, and I'm not for one and against another, so the versus is maybe not the best way to put it, but they're quite different. So government grants tend to be, they're set by legislation what it is that they will be funding. They have maybe I should say application processes that can be known. They sometimes can seem mysterious if you've never looked at a NOFO before, a notice of funding opportunity. If you want to talk federal grant language, they have very firm deadlines, but they offer you technical assistance. And I have had to. I've been on the phone with, I got an error message and my grant is due in 5 minutes. Help. But they're going to be more bureaucratic. Lengthier proposals are required. And it takes a lot longer to hear if your grant has been funded or not. You know, there's a grant I apply for from the NHPRC, which is a federal funder, every June, and I find out in November, and then the grant starts the next July. So it doesn't have to be quite that long, but it often is a little lugubrious in its pace. There are often more requirements, including reporting, but that said, they'll be pretty clear about what it is they need from you. And the federal funders have in the last few years done a great job of putting more information up on their websites, everything from sample proposal narratives that have been successful to really specific details about what you should put in your reports. And they are often able to provide more funding than some of the other sources that might have that might be available to you. So you can go for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. For other types of funders, and this is specifically foundations, you may need to be invited to apply. So that's a huge obstacle. And there you might have to try to wiggle around and find out who knows somebody who is involved with that foundation, or who could let them know about you, and then they could maybe apply to you, invite you to apply. Long ago, I worked down in Philadelphia and was at the Historical Society of Philadelphia, and we were invited by the Mellon Foundation in New York to come up and make a pitch. You know, there were 3 different organizations from Philly that went up and proposed projects to them, but we could not, it's not like we could have knocked on the door or sent them in an application without that invite. So there can be, that can be an obstacle to these other funders. But if you can get your foot in the door, you often have a much less complicated proposal to do. For some smaller foundations, it's literally just a letter. And this might be a better source for local needs, because they might know, if it's a local foundation, they might know your community better and be able to kind of assess, yes, this is the perfect thing that should be happening right now. And they can be easier to administer because they're less complex. It's typically not a lot of interim reporting. You just have a final report, but they have limited staff, so they're not necessarily going to be someone who can help you if you have questions, or it might take a while for them to get back to you. Whereas, you know, I just called my program officer yesterday morning and had a wonderful half-hour conversation with him, just to kind of bounce some ideas around that, because what to do with the grant this June, and that was really wonderful to do. So usually the government grants, at least at the state level, but at the state level and the federal level, are going to have folks whose job it is to help you apply for grants successfully. So the big federal funders, and most obvious for you all, is the IMLS. One that surprised me is I did a little research this morning about the National Endowment for the Arts, the NEA. I was curious, had they supported libraries in the past? And they have. They've funded in the last couple years virtual makerspaces, One Book, One Minnesota book festival. So a lot of these are kind of literary, a summer reading program, literary programming more generally. But they also funded in Lexington, Kentucky, this really creative collaboration between a photographer and an artist and a poet, and made these Roman blinds that were then hung in the library that represented the city's struggle with civil rights over time, and it was called I Was Here. So and they got $20,000 to do that. So it was great to see that NEA is supporting library programming and other initiatives. And the NEH, the one, and Tia knows about this, the Preservation Assistance Grant for smaller organizations, it's more if you have a local history collection that has manuscripts and archives, photographs, not just published materials. That might be a potential source for training, supplies, and equipment that you could delve into. It's also good because it's one of those starter grants. It's a small grant. It does not require a match, and can kind of get you started with the NEH or with federal grants more broadly. And I looked at the IMLS's current offerings, and there's nothing really that stood out or was that looked like I would be something I would want to recommend to you all to explore right now. But it's good to periodically check their websites, because there will be initiatives that will be available for a year or two. The NEH had a wonderful community scanning day opportunity for maybe 3 or 4 years that often took place at public libraries. I participated in one down in Massachusetts at Westboro. So there will be these ones that might be good fits for projects you're interested in, might be smaller grants. So don't be afraid of the federal funders, and don't just rule them out entirely. And I'll talk a little bit more in a bit about another grant from the NEH. Funders in Vermont, VT Lib, and Joy is a great resource for telling you and offering advice about the opportunities available there. And of course, with ARPA funds, this is unprecedented, and we'll probably not see this again in our lifetimes, the amount of money that is available for all sorts of work, including things for activities and infrastructure for libraries. The Vermont Arts Council, as I mentioned, has the Cultural Facilities Grant in particular, but there's also potential for a collaboration with artists, kind of like that Kentucky project, that it might be an arts grant, but it might be situated in the library, or somehow the library could be involved in related programming that would be tied in with that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be building related. But if you're interested in building improvements, this is the grant that I would look at the state level. And they're also good for hazard mitigation funding and ADA compliance and accessibility. It's really important to the folks at the Arts Council. So those are, if you've got ADA issues you want to try to resolve, please take a look at that grant. If you have a historic building, the historic preservation grants from the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation are a good option as well. And they're wonderful to work with. Again, it's sometimes more challenging to work with a grant funding source, but I currently personally have a historic barn grant going, and it's been really good to work with them, even though we've had a lot of bumps in the road in terms of timber framer not being able to do it, and just again, communication has been good, but they've been really wonderful and easy to work with. So don't kind of think, oh, it's going to be just too much paperwork, because it's not horrible. It's really not. The Vermont Humanities Council is really interested in community engagement around the humanities, obviously, but they have grants available, and they're presently kind of retooling some of their opportunities. And through the pandemic, the Arts Council and the Humanities Council have been working together on some funding that was made available earlier on. So it's nice to see sometimes how the funders start to collaborate as well. And of course, the Vermont Community Foundation is one of those aggregators of all sorts of different types of funds, small pots, big pots, some that are regionally restricted, and some that are for specific types of audiences or for specific types of need. So that's another source that can be good to look through. And don't overlook the local as you're looking at kind of state level funders. It may be, depending where you live, that your municipality might be able to provide some funding, either through getting people in town in favor of it and getting something in front of the community at town meeting, or approaching local banks or businesses And, banks will often have, Mascoma Bank is really committed to to granting funds and supporting local projects. Vermont National Life has a foundation. They give a couple $1 million out a year. And many businesses will also be interested in some sort of support and these will usually be easier. It's in some cases with foundations of banks and insurance companies, and of course with municipalities, there will be more paperwork, but some businesses, it can be pretty straightforward in terms of what's required of you both before and after the ask. It's often just they want credit, they want their name somewhere in bright lights, being thanked for making it possible, and that's good enough for them. There's some resources available for locating funders because it's you know what you know, but you may not know what you don't know. The Vermont Directory of Foundations Online is something that the Community Foundation makes available, and it's kind of based on or spawns from the Foundation Center's Visualizing Funding for Libraries tool, which is national. And then but I think the best, as always, is really word of mouth. Where do your peer institutions, where have they gotten support? And I've worked on a fundraising committee with a woman who was always looking at the programs when she would go to shows and go to arts events to see who was funding the program, and then would see that those were potential funders. Like, oh, I didn't know that law firm gave out money for cultural things. Interesting. They might be a potential for a project you'd be interested in. And Joy, you were just telling me this morning about a funding opportunity that you learned about at a local library.
Yes, that was the Amplify grants from RISE. Well, it's One Care Vermont. It's called the RISE Amplified Grant. And there have been several libraries that have gotten grants from them. It's regional. I'm not sure exactly which region it is, but they are responsible for a lot of the libraries that have snowshoes in Vermont. And they also recently gave some funding for garden beds. So they do things that are around creating healthy environments and communities, and lots of times libraries fit into that. So keep your eye on them if you are in the right region for that. I'll put a link to it in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. And there was also the water bottle filler from Green Up Vermont.
Yes, that was another one, and I think that might have been a one-time thing, but just it was a great example of she applied for a grant from Green Up Vermont and now has a water bottle filler in the library, and she heard about that actually from her town administrator. So I think Rachel already mentioned this, but make sure you're in close touch with those people because they often become aware of grants that you might not have heard of otherwise, and so make sure you're on their radar as one of the organizations that can apply for things like that when they come up.
Yep, that's true. And just to give you a peek, I'm not going to hop onto the internet, but I will show you a screenshot of what the Vermont Directory of Foundations Online looks like. So you can hunt and peck in various different ways. So I looked just for libraries that had gotten building and renovation funds from 2003 to 2022. And what's fascinating when you look at this, because these are foundations, which are pretty mysterious, can be, you would want to dig into, some of them are clear, like the Charlotte Library got Friends of the Charlotte Library, gave them funding. But then you have the Philadelphia Foundation giving funding. You have the Oregon Community Foundation from Portland, Oregon giving money. So it's not as easy to mine this data set, but if you go to the foundation Visualizing for Libraries, the larger one, you can do lots more with the data. So you could go in and see, get more details about each of these foundations and what their funding areas are, and what the project was specifically that they funded at these different libraries. So again, this is a one way to see what other people are getting funding for and from whom. And it's a pretty slick interface, and it lets you do, again, it's visualizing. So you can, if you prefer dots, look at dots and see how things, both recipients and funders are. You can also look at how they're connected, or look at the Aldrich and see all the different places they've gotten money from over the years and how that's connected to where other libraries have gotten funding from. So those can be a good way to just try to become more familiar with the landscape of what is available out there, because there are tens of thousands of foundations out there. And again, kind of back to, you can do that, and you can also keep your eyes open for what other libraries, what sources they've been using, and where they've gotten some support in the past. One of my favorite little Vermont foundations is the John M. Bissell Foundation in Stowe, and the Vermont Historical Society has gotten funding from them in the past. They like to support Vermont film and filmmakers, and it's a really, this is one of those, you write a letter and then they write you back and then you get a check. And it's for wonderful types of projects. So if you've got film or interest in supporting a local filmmaker, you want to try to figure something out, this is one that I'll just flag for you because I've had really great experience with them myself. So yeah, this research, it can be time consuming, and this can be, if you are a trustee, or if you have a trustee who's loves to do research, this could be something you could set somebody on to find out more about particular funders. It's the federal funders especially have all of their past awards online, so you can look and see who's been funded for what, and get a good sense of what their interests have been more recently, both by looking at what they've funded and what their current opportunities are. And foundations can be more difficult. They may not even have websites, so you can try other means. That's when some of those two websites I just showed you can be helpful for finding out more detail. And being aware of the funding cycles, they tend to, sometimes it's once a year, some opportunities are available twice a year. If there's an annual report, again, that could give you more information about what they're interested in. And some funders will have their strategic plan even available to really kind of, and then you can see how does your strategic plan align with theirs. And this is where you can start to shake out who's going to be the best fit for your priorities. And I just want to say, you don't want to lose sight of that. It's important to remember, what is it that's most important for you in your library to get or to do, and to not necessarily, Bridget maybe wanted to do all 9 of those grants simultaneously. There was just too many good opportunities, you couldn't pass them up. But if thinking about being strategic about what you go for when and what's going to make the most sense is good. And make contact. Most places are going to be, with a big exception of foundations, but all the other types of funders, get in touch with them. See what they say when you bounce some ideas off of them. And make sure you're reading guidelines closely to find out if you are, there's nothing worse than having a great idea, finding the perfect grant opportunity for that project, getting into it, and then realizing, oh gosh, I didn't look at the eligibility criteria closely enough. I am actually not, my organization isn't eligible for whatever reason. One that may well be an issue for some of you is a nonprofit status. But even if your library is not a nonprofit, if you have a friends group, if they are registered as a nonprofit, it may be that they can apply on behalf of the library. And that's something that you'll see if you look at some of these foundation databases, it's the friends who are actually the ones who are awarded the funds. And you can maintain a prospect sheet, like a working list of, these are the funders out there, and these are the opportunities that are available. And over time, you'll see some that they're just constant. They're always there, like through the Community Foundation. If you're down in Windham County, the Crosby Gannett Fund of up to $2,500, it's available. Like, that seems to be pretty steady. But some of these little ones that pop up within the federal grants, they come and go. So being aware that some might be fleeting, but you could always call up and say, is this just going to be a one-off, or is this going to be around for a while? And they'll tell you. So this photo is from the Barboursville Public Library in West Virginia, and they just this May 13th, they did a ribbon cutting. And this is one that I found when I was looking through the NEH awards from the last couple years. And I saw that this library had gotten a $400,000 challenge grant from the NEH for infrastructure and capacity building. And $400,000 is a lot of money. These challenge grants, however, require a 3-to-1 match, meaning that they had to raise 1.2 million in order to receive that 400,000. So I kind of went onto the internet to see if I could find the library, and at first it looked like they were still in their mangy 1967 building. But then I went to their Facebook page, and lo and behold, they had succeeded in raising that money. So I put that out there as kind of just, hopefully this is the inspirational moment of how this pretty little library in West Virginia was able to successfully raise enough funds to match what they needed to bring in to get a significant federal grant. So that was great. And again, just to bang on this a little bit more, make sure you're matching your institutional priorities and the priorities of the funders. Don't be swayed by particular opportunities that may not fit well with yours. So let me pause for a moment here and ask if there's questions about what I've covered so far before we dive into kind of the nuts and bolts of the proposal writing. So Joy, is it okay if folks, can they put things in the chat, or should they just go ahead and unmute?
They can do either one. So Bridget, you've got your hand up. You want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Rachel, can you explain a little bit more what you mean by capacity building?
Yeah, it's where I can use my own grant as an opportunity, as an example. So in 2017, the state archivist asked her boss, the Secretary of State, if she could have $15,000 seed money to bring in a part-time temporary roving archivist. And he said, sure. So with that $15,000, she hired me to start as a temp part-time. The first thing I did was write a federal grant that then allowed the position to become full-time, and wrote another grant that allowed it to continue to be full-time. And in the third year, the Secretary of State went to the legislature, and actually it was written into the big bill to create this position as a permanent position within the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. The state archivist then decided that one of the archivists already working at Vasara could also work with me on the VHRP. So now we have 2 permanent staff working full-time to support the work of the VHRP, which is primarily providing technical assistance to historical records repositories, specifically in Vermont, but also in other parts of the country. So that's an example of kind of the building the capacity. We need money from you, funder, for a limited time, but if you give it to us, we're going to be able to leverage it in such a way that we are going to be able to do more on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, that's super helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I will launch again. So diving in at this point into how you conceptualize a project, how you might prepare to draft it, and some proposal tips and strategies, and then some concerns that come up with that are often issues with grant proposals. Be aware of. So some of this I've touched on already in talking about the bigger picture, but you really want to be this shouldn't be coming out of left field. It should be aligned with your values, your interests, and your needs. both of the library and especially of your community. So this is where some of the preliminary work might be to survey your community or do a needs assessment of some sort. And that would be if you're looking for a programming or community engagement project. But if it's a building project, again, that would be a different kind of set of people you might call on, and a different type of assessment that you would do to find out what you need to do to get some to build your building capacity. And it's the other important thing is to recognize it's a balancing act between developing a project that your library really needs, and for what projects funding is available, and to try to not, as I've already said, not be too swayed by what people are offering money for if it's really not what you need. It's maybe a distraction from your core mission. That said, it's good to brainstorm and have kind of a working list of projects, which could be mundane and kind of the more if we really kind of ought to need to do this stuff, but it might also be more visionary, or what if we could, or oh, there's this great person in town and how do we bring them in and the work they do and how do we showcase that, or yeah, there's this great plot of land next to us. Wouldn't it be great to have a community garden or free food or the seed library, those kinds of things? Like, is there funding for that? So have an idea, you know, can have a list going at any point of things that might be interesting, because then often we are opportunistic about stuff. So if you end up having a trustee who comes in who's a master gardener and has experience building community gardens in the past, you know, suddenly that might weight that priority a little higher. You know, we're always working with our different resources, and people being a primary one, especially in our smaller communities. It is down to the individuals who are engaged, and how do you continue to keep them engaged, and how do you help them do their best work and provide them some support so they can continue to develop there. It's really terrific to work with others on your project ideas. I used to be, and I think it was maybe about insecurity and lack of confidence. I mean, I think I'm a decent writer, but I wouldn't want to share my grant proposals with anybody that I worked with, like my colleagues. I would just submit them without getting vetted. And then I had the opportunity to work with a really wonderful development officer at HSP, and realized how great it was to do these together and be collaborative about developing the project and conceptualizing it, and then also about the writing process. Because one thing you've got to do in these narratives is really sell yourself, or sell the library, sell your organization. And that's something that I'm not very comfortable doing that. But she would come in and put her development language all over it and just make us sound like the greatest place, which I thought we were, but I wouldn't sing it out the way she would. So it's great if you have someone with that ability also on your team, who can take your ideas, which maybe you're kind of stuck in this is what I want to do, this is how to do it, and I'm the best person to write this up because I know exactly how to do it. But then someone else can kind of make it sing. And collaboration is really important, even if it's just kind of a one-off within your library kind of a project. If you are working with a consultant or a partner, you're going to want to get, you may need a letter from them, you need a quote from a consultant, you need to get some stuff, you need to give them ample time in advance to have some back and forth about what their product to you is going to be, and make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of expectations. And great to start with a small grant, with something that's going to be not asking too much of you, both in terms of how can you really do this on top of your existing responsibilities, and you being your organization, or is it going to be a little overwhelming? And aligned with that, try to set both real and realistic goals, so you're not not doing something that's just going to be too hard to actually pull off. Chances are the reviewers of the proposal will see if it's unrealistic, but in some cases it might even be worse if they don't see that. You sell them on the project, but then you're stuck doing it and you realize there's no way in heck you can actually achieve it. And that's not a great place to be either. So things to think about there. And then as you're preparing, again, back to just the funding guidelines, for foundations or for some funding sources, this is not going to be too onerous, but these federal grants do have very extensive guidelines, and it can be a process just to become familiar with getting oriented to where you find the information you need within the guidelines. So that can be time consuming, but valuable. Then all of the federal funders have kind of the same structure. So once you get it for one, the next one will be easier. You should write each grant application for a specific funder. So you may have a project and you actually are pitching it to multiple funders. And one thing I haven't mentioned is that you can use, if you have one of these grants that requires a cost share, you can't match federal funds with federal funds, and some state funds are federal funds, so you've got to be mindful of that. But you absolutely, in most cases, should be able to match a federal grant with matching funds from a foundation or from local organizations or businesses that are interested in supporting your project. And you can get a grant that can build momentum, and once money does beget money. So if you've got some funding, that can attract attention and notice and inspire others to support you too. Again, make contact with the funder, ask questions, become known to them, and they'll go to bat for you. And it's often the staff are having to make the case to the external reviewers, and it may be that they're in a position to actually explain what they know you mean if it wasn't clear to the reviewer. So they can help you kind of in that room where those decisions finally do get made, if they're more familiar with your project and not just, yeah, I read the application too, I'm not sure what that's about. Many funders will have a draft. They'll be willing to look at a draft. So that's also something you can ask if you can do. And make sure you've done your background research so you can make the best case possible. And for deadlines, work back from it and set a schedule for yourself or for your team if you're trying to work on a proposal together. But don't forget, they want to give out, they have to give out money, and they might as well give it to you. So this is, it's a positive thing. So do your best to make it easy for them to support your project. So read successful proposals if that's something that the funder does make available. Follow their guidelines. Be prepared to sell your project or work with someone who can. And demonstrate the significance of the project for your audiences, and demonstrate that you've prepared for the proposed activity. And this is where some homework can come in. Do surveys of your community or of your building, that kind of stuff, to show that this is something that they want, or that this is a need that has come up and that you are going to be meeting through this project. And you want to do, as I said, a custom proposal for different funders, but you can absolutely cut and paste some boilerplate from one proposal to the other. And something that you inevitably have to include is something about the history of your library and description of your recent activities. So just getting that worked up in advance can be good to do if you don't already have that available. I'm a fan of having a punch list. I can't write with an outline, but some people swear by it and find it's really helpful. I will take the different sections. They'll usually tell you what sections there are within the narrative if it's not a simple letter request. And I will kind of keep what they're saying they want in front of me, literally, as I'm writing. So I will paste their suggestions for what they're looking for in each section into my working document so that I can make sure I am answering that as I go through my actual writing. I'm terrible at titles, but it's good to have something that can grab you. So again, get some help if you're not that person either. You want to be somewhat formal in your writing, so use a third person, be clear and concise, use active verbs, avoid jargon. I feel like I'm an English teacher right now, but this stuff this might be, things you're dimly remembering, but yes, this is all important to do. And avoid jargon. This is important. We love our acronyms, but it may be that there are folks reading these proposals who are not librarians. So they may not know what OCLC is or Dublin Core, or they may know some things, but not what's metadata or how do you mean it. So if you're going to use some word, if there's a need to use a specific type of word, do try to give an explanation or definition of it. And you can use bulleted lists. You don't want to just have a bunch of, you do want to have narrative, but you can, in places where it makes sense, use bullets, have some white space, illustrations, photos, if that's permitted, can be really helpful. And really focus on working on the beginning and the end of your narrative to make sure that those start and end well. And just a few more. Often you are invited, if not required, to include letters of support. I will often actually ghostwrite the letters of support. I will ask the person if they are willing to write and say I will provide a draft. And of course, they're welcome to write their own letter or to revise my draft significantly if they want to. But it's a chance for me to kind of make sure that there's other perspectives on my project that are being represented. Because there's some things where you can't say it because you're not the community member. But if you have the community member talking about this is a really important project for our town and signing it community member, that can really strengthen your proposal. And people are often really grateful to have the letter at least drafted for them. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, use lots of outside readers, get some colleagues, get some people who don't know anything about the topic that you are proposing as well, because then they'll catch those. This is kind of jargony, or I don't know what you mean by this, and help you kind of make sure you're being really clear in what you're writing. And then again, more for these federal grants, make sure you're submitting all the documentation in the correct order with the correct file names. My program officer was talking about you have to submit PDFs, and someone submitted a Word doc, and it was horrible for him that, because then the application was denied because of that issue. So you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And just to say, if there's something you can do that really makes it stand out, either you've got a letter from someone really influential in your community, or really hideous pictures of what your building facade looks like and how it's about to collapse if you don't get some funding soon. You want to make sure that your readers are grasping that this is an important project and these people know what they want to do with it, with our funds. Just a couple other things to think about. Being aware of what to expect when working with a consultant, as I mentioned already, just to be mindful that they may need to negotiate with you about, and they'll often write a letter of commitment, which is slightly different than a letter of support. It says basically they commit to assisting your library by facilitating 3 strategic planning processes, strategic planning meetings with your board, and lead a stakeholder group, and make sure you've got it all kind of spelled out, and that they're giving you a quote on what they want, what they need financially for that work. And make sure you know what accounts you need before you can even apply for a federal grant. So the System for Award Management, or SAM, no longer a DUNS number. Now you need the UEI, which is the Unique Entity Identifier, and then the grants.gov interface, which I apply once a year, and that's just infrequently enough to make me really anxious. So I know how difficult it can be to try to engage with that entire system. But that's again, that's Joy and I are here to try to support you through that process. And the budget is another place to be pretty careful. You need to, in some cases, identify where you're going to get cost share if that's required, and that could be from individual donors or local fundraising. Volunteer time, you can often be in-kind match. So that's all stuff you're going to have to think about and make sure you're accurately reflecting. And you don't want to pad your budget. You want to make sure you're not, you know, just don't be too general in kind of throwing money into different pots. Make it pretty clear that this is how much it's going to cost, and make sure it's a reasonable cost. It's another space where it's good to often talk to your program officer. Especially if you're working with a consultant and they want, you know, $1,500 a day, talk to the program officer or someone at the foundation. You know, is this going to raise eyebrows, or is this considered acceptable? So you can often get a second opinion about that. And you don't want to be have errors in your budget. This is one of the common concerns with applications. And I was just talking to an organization I work with a lot that they got turned down on a grant last year because of a simple error in their budget. And just to think, you know, they went through this beautiful project narrative, had everything else in line, but a couple numbers were screwed up, but they're reapplying this year. So it's just something to kind of be watching for. Other things, if you have not communicated with your program officer, that can either not help you or potentially hinder you if there is questions about your proposal that they're not able to answer for the reviewers. Failure to follow the current guidelines. Make sure you're working with what's on the website or what's been published recently. If you've got things that are not well described, you haven't done you haven't quantified your need very effectively, that could be an issue. If there's a project work plan and you have not have enough detail in that about how you're actually going to do the thing you say you want to do, that can hurt your chances. And typos or other kind of grammatical errors or other sloppiness can be a ding with certain reviewers as well. And not having any letters of support. So it's sometimes better, even if you find out about an opportunity and you've got like 48 hours to get it in, might be better just to hold off rather than just to dash it off. But make sure you've got kind of a complete package to present to a funder, even if that means maybe holding off on the current opportunity. And missing information on project staff. You usually have to kind of put in who's going to do what and give some biographical or even sometimes a resume for them. So making sure you've got all that in a line. So I just, again, don't hesitate to reach out to me and to Joy. I know, you know, we've both read grant drafts. Happy to conceptualize projects with people. Happy to help, even if it's kind of, I want to do this, what's a good source? You know, I'll run around and do some legwork. I'll talk to Joy. Joy can do it too. What might be a good place to go for the type of project you're interested in. So please, really want to see more grant funding come to Vermont. And that was actually that was stipulated on a couple of the federal funder sites, that we were a place identified that that had priority for funding for them, because again, they like to see their money spread out across the country, and they weren't getting a lot of proposals from our state. So whatever we can do to help, please don't hesitate. Well, thanks for your time and attention. I'm sorry we've gone over. I will say, just because the intros went on a little longer, I thought it might be okay to go on a little longer, but I appreciate those of you who stuck it out, and I'm happy to stick around and take any questions.